Many thanks. So it's always a pleasure and honor to be able to do a paper here in Cambridge. And I will focus on the concept of Zimzum, which Douglas discussed in the first paper this morning, and its role in the debate between Christian Knorr von Rosenroth, Franciscus Mercurius von Holland, and Henry Moore. So I think there's no denying the fact that Moore's writings on the Kabbalah are among the most influential of his writings. And this has to do with one of the major controversies of early modern philosophy, the so-called pantheism controversy, which may be seen as a continuation of Moore's earlier critical comments on Christian Knorr von Rosenroth and Franciscus Mercurius von Holland's editorial work. So in many ways, it's as much an English as it is a German debate. So several German philosophers are involved. And of course, this culminates in what is today known as the pantheism controversy, sparked off by the great Enlightenment and rationalist thinker Lessing. And Van Helmont and Moore actually mentioned in this celebrated discussion between Lessing and Jacobi. It all has to do with the Hengstermann plan as the creed of the idea that once we were alone, he began, thus I've come to talk to you about my Hengstermann plan. If you tried yesterday, and then the discussion is about determinism, fatalism, which apparently Lessing embraces. And it has to do with his rather ironic Spinozist creed, because Leibniz, from first to last, was a follower of Leibniz. So clearly he is bent on infuriating his dialogue partner at this stage of the conversation, saying that, well, I'm a Spinozist and I know of no other creed, but clearly he's a critic of Spinoza in the vein of Leibniz. And he frequently quotes Henry Moore at that, so as a representative of the ancient theology, which he too holds dear. And it has to do with a principle that is at the core of the debates between Moore and his German Flemish Sulzbach Kabbalist Nihilo Nihil bit. And it also has to do with the great concept of Zimzum or contraction. So second bit where Henry Moore and Francis Mercurius von Holland are actually mentioned by name. One Lessing said to me, half joking, that perhaps he himself was the highest being and at present in a state of utmost contraction I beg for my existence. You see, this is rather funny, but at core, it's about the question of individuation, something that David mentioned in his paper. And this is the discussion that these two figures of enlightenment engage in here. The answer to that wasn't what he meant. It explains why such a fashion is reminding of Henry Moore and Francis Mercurius von Holland, philosophus per unum in omnia. So the philosopher through the one in which all things are. And then the Kabbalah is actually mentioned, and we can show that Lessing actually read Cutler to intellectual system, in most times celebrated Latin translation with notes which detail the contemporary background, right, Leibniz, and the consequences, as well as the Kabbalah Denudata, which was the standard work of Kabbalism in the day. So basically, what's his name again? So Kabbalah and its parents. So what was the name again? The celebrated author everyone quotes when it comes to Kabbalah.
Gershom Scholem.
Yeah, exactly. So this well, that was at the time. No? So, and we can show that there's a direct continuity between the pantheism controversy, which everyone knows about, and these seemingly elusive writings by Henry Moore, published in the Kabbalah Denudata. And it points us to a set of constellations that we want to explore as part of this editorial undertaking called the Latin Works of Henry Moore. And David has already drawn our attention to Spinocism, right, as the third major current of thought criticized by Moore. And Moore himself views these three currents of thought, that is Babylonianism, Cabbalism, and Spinocism, as embodiments of one and the same mindset that he tries to combat, namely an enthusiasm that ultimately leads to atheism. And it all starts with Bergman. Of course, I want to advertise the first volume, right? Because our series has been launched already, right? It started. and we've published the first volume, which is about More's critique of Böhme. And thanks to some of the more remote pieces of writing devoted to the critique of the Teutonic philosophy, we can tell that More engaged with Böhme's work far longer than is usually stated in the usual introduction to his thought. It all started in the 40s when he refused to read Böhme properly because he found him too elusive. But then we know from Worthington that More and his associates had their ears full of Baptism and Reggae, something of which there's a literary account of sorts in the Divine Dialogues. And then, most importantly, we have the letter about JV. So it is mentioned under that title in Worthington's correspondence. So this is the terminus ante quem, basically. So it's mentioned that year. So it was finished by then. It was then translated sometime around 1675 when More prepared his Latin works, his philosophical works for print, as the Philosophia Teutonica Censura, which I translated for the first volume of our series. And interestingly enough, he continued to work in his critique of the Teutonic philosophy, adding Scholia, as always, adding 2 entire chapters, which is interesting in its own rights, namely the Ad Lectorem, which wasn't included in the original letter. So very few are aware of that, but it's pretty obvious given the overview of the contents provided in the original correspondence, and a conclusio. And it shows that he had changed his views about Böhme. So Böhme originally was just another enthusiast for him, but then he changed into an ally, basically. So in the end, he will praise Böhme as one who overcomes his own enthusiasm in favor of the ancient theology of idealism. So when feminism is mentioned in the Confutatio, which David talked about, actually only Spinoza is charged of it, whereas Böhme isn't. Böhme is in fact the one who allows us and helps us to overcome enthusiasm as an important and perfect natural state of the human mind. So we have to be enthusiasts first because we embrace material phenomena. Then we become panpsychists because we see that matter can't produce all these ordered phenomena. And then we move on, of course, to the heights of Platonism. And in this conclusion, which he adds as he translates that work into English, he actually praises Böhme as a representative of the Platonic theology, even crediting him with insights on a par with those of Plotinus, which is actually a quote. So when we interpret More, especially his later writings, we have to be aware of these overlapping constellations and networks. So as he interprets one volume of works, especially one of these 3 that our first 3 volumes will be about, he also has in mind the others, revisiting and revising his earlier critique as he goes on. So it makes for several overlapping hermeneutic processes, which we have to be aware of. And feminism is very much alive in the Cabbalistic data, that is, in the commentaries composed by More at the behest of Christian Knorr von Rosenroth. Perhaps as interesting as this Baptist network, which includes the almost forgotten radical Baptists, right? Charles Hotham, Durand Hotham, Sparrow, the great translator of Böhme's works. As interesting as that, certainly is circle best described as Sulzbach, Kabbalists and Quakers who gathered at Regnier Hall at the time. So in 1668, George P., the Quaker, publishes his Immediate Revelation, which is basically an overview of More's epistemology proper. So he, as is well known, credits his conversion to Quakerism to his reading of the Grand Mystery of Godliness, and it shows. And this is the background against which Regnier Hall becomes the center of Calvinist discussion. Yep. With Francis Mercurius van Helmont staying at Regnier Hall for almost a decade, the epistolary debates between More and Christian Knorr von Rosenroth, which again is laid down in the Cabbalistic Data 1 and 2, Conway principles, with von Rosenroth, as Jasper convincingly argued later on translating it. This important work by Conway into English, adding Cabbalistic footnotes of his own. And interestingly enough, he goes on to advertise More's work in the European Republic of Letters, translating the work by Thomas Brown and adding excerpts, interestingly enough, from Leibniz's for the whole treatise entitled Hypothesis Physica Nova, as well as excerpts from More's Enchiridion Metaphysicum and his Grand Mystery of Godliness. And we have other writings in which this discussion is carried on even after More's and Conway's death, with Christian Knoch von Rosenroth emerging as the pivotal figure, right, who is in charge of all the Cabbalistic transactions, right, around the world at Sulzbach in Germany. And it then culminates, as I want to argue, in Amsterdam and Cambridge Spinozism, which is in many ways the crowning achievement of More's critique of what he deemed detrimental currents of thought in his day. Yes. And to start with, I just want to give when it comes to philosophy proper, an overview of More's key concern when it comes to his critique. Yeah.
Just a tiny thing.
Yeah.
Why are you saying 1682? Where's that year coming?
Yeah, I think from the Aurelianus book, she dates it to that year.
Okay.
So it was published as part of the Cabbalistic Data. Yeah. So might be.
Okay.
So I check. Yeah, thank you for alerting me to that. So what role does Cabbalism play in this later part of More's literary production? More is an author who engages in dramatizing of sorts, right, when it comes to his own work. And Cabbalism is a case in point, right, because it functions or is introduced as a certain mixed kind of philosophy, and is deliberately placed between Böhme's Theism and Spinoza's atheism in the opera Omnia. And when it comes to his critique of Cabbalistic thought, More applies what I call the truth, one-form truth of divine infinity, and it has to do with this first power of human cognition, which is that of divine goodness in two embodiments, basically, in its supreme transcendence and its ubiquitous immanence, that it forms the cosmos. And this is considered the heart of what he calls the boniform faculty, the capacity for intuitive vision of this first of the divine predicates, that is supreme goodness. Text on the handout, where he finds intellectual love. And what is this intellectual love, he asks? But an inward life and sense that moves in the boniform faculty of the soul. It is by this soul reality what is simply the best. Thither it tends, and that alone it has its joy and triumph. So something David had publicly great in the Bible. So it's affective and cognitive in nature. Once we intuit divine goodness, we cannot but fall in love with it, embrace it, right? Make it the prime moving principle of all our actions. And it has a two-part object. First, divine transcendence. Hence, we are instructed how to set God before our eyes, to love him above all, to embrace him as the highest and most perfect good, as the highest and most perfect reason and beauty, and as the highest and most perfect love, by which all things are created and continue to exist. And then we have to participate in the descent undergone by the deity, so as to share its life with all of creation. Hence, also the soul taught how to affect and admire the creation, all the parts of it, to the extent that each of them shares that divine perfection and beneficence, which is dispersed through the whole mass, something added by the translator. And from that flows the first principle of Morean ethics, so that if any of these parts appears defective or discomposed, the soul compassionates and brings health. So note the focus on agency as well as empathy. So we need to have pity on everything. That makes the order intended for things by God Himself, as it is able. So to restore everything to that state of felicity which God and nature intended for it. So this has a Spinozist ring to it, right? So we have this concern with the conatus, right? But it's a conatus entirely different from Spinoza's, obviously. So building on what David has pointed out in his paper, so this is a conatus that aims for disinterested love, right? That we follow and try and imitate universal and disinterested divine goodness. And it is an intention pursued by God and nature alike. So this is basically the program towards rational philosophy. This is a wonderful vision, and this is what we have to spell out in speculative thought, right? So that God and nature have this intention of restoring everything. Note the origin in universalism, everything to that state of felicity which God and nature intended for it. Finally, the soul spares no effort to allow good man to prosper and devotes all its care and discipline to making bad man good. And this is exactly the two-part criterion that he applies to these three major currents of early modern thought, i.e. Bamianism, Cabbalism, and Spinozism. And this is where first he engages with Böhmer's thought, which he considers misguided to a certain extent, but which is driven by this insight into divine goodness, as is visible in Böhmer's accounts of his own conversion. So the Philosophia Teutonica gets Suhai, as I've said, some shameless advertising here for the first volume, but I think it matters in terms of More's development, because this is the heart of the Sophia Teutonica in Suhai, and it's More's translation of Böhmer's philosophy into Orthodox Platonism. So this is the first major achievement of this work, written on behalf of N. Conway, who had set queries about Bami's philosophy. And we've got the seven source spirits here, right, which bring about the deity in a theogonic process. And he translated that into an Orthodox Platonist exemplarism, right, with the Trinity at the top and a natural Trinity at the bottom, with each level mirroring the level below. Right? The supreme bonum, the highest good, is mirrored by the abyssus physicarum monadum, the use of this historic concept, right? So the one of the good is reflected in the one of the atom, right? The atom is being gathered so as to reflect this supreme goodness, overflowing and sharing its riches with all of reality. The itemus intellectus, right? The Plotinian intellect, mirrored by the unconscious spirit of nature, doing its bidding, nevertheless. And perhaps most intriguingly, the divina anima, the word soul from Plato's Timaeus, right? And the Holy Spirit mirrored in the anima. No? And this is where perhaps more, in a way, some more fell for Bamianism, as we can tell from his later scholias. So the scholia, just as we discussed during the break, right, are among his most exciting writings, because he draws our attention to things that he shouldn't have said, according to his own estimate. His philosophy in the Caesura is far more Bamianist than it should have been. And among that, we find flirtations with what we could call a cosmic theism, even to the point that the word is considered part of this supreme deity, because referring to Plotinus, he actually embraces Böhmer's idea of God in the world making up the deity. So he says, and taken together and viewed as one immense sixfold sphere whose forms penetrate one another throughout all the six forms, this whole or universe is called theos by that same philosopher, i.e. the whole or complete deity or universal origin from which all particular things proceed. And as you can see, we've got this retraction as Conway and Hellman worked on their unorthodox Cabbalistic projects, which struck terribly towards heart. He begins to notice his own flirtations with this problematic religious philosophy and says, well, it's true that Plotinus conceived of the world, of the universe as God. However, if one pays sufficient regard to the holiness of the divine majesty, one will both in word and matter make a most religious distinction between the sphere of pure divinity and the sphere of universal nature. And so on. Copy twice here, you see. And this is one of the main driving forces of his readings of the Kabbalah, right? This robust concept of transcendence, which keeps apart the deity above and the world below. Even more interestingly, he retracts his earlier reading of Böhme's cosmology to a certain point. So he tries to translate Böhme's theology into a cosmogony, saying, well, this is all true, in fact. This is all very good in terms of religious philosophy, but it doesn't refer to the deity, but to the world itself, which in the process takes on the character of a person gradually emerging as God shares its forms with the world. He calls the world sort of a gigantic register in which all our memories and the like are stored. And again, it's something that he came to have a funny feeling about as he reviewed his writings when translating the Hengstermann. So here we see more at his desk. Right? So he translates that into English, sees, well, this is problematic, so let's add a scholium. This is difficult because we've got these Kabbalists doing all the unorthodox stuff here. And I'm a bit afraid of me being misunderstood to that effect. Yeah, you have this grand idea instead. So the shadows and shapes of all things will be inscribed in the memory of the world, so which has got immense register, as it were. But if it were not for the vital operation of the spirit of nature as it fashions things from the abyss of physical moments, the soul of the world would remain in perpetual silence and darkness, having neither perception of itself nor anything else. And here, he tries to soften the effect of his own quasi panpsychism. To my mind, it's absolutely certain that the world soul possesses neither reason nor free will, and without reason, it also lacks recollection. But if it has any at all, it may have some passive memory evidence, one that is almost mindless, and if it has any remembrance in it, it must be elicited by someone else. However, these things are covered in immense and impenetrable obscurity and darkness. I think this is absolutely important. We want to acquire a proper understanding of Conway's philosophical method, because these are things that she, as the addressee, the origin addressee of this letter about Jakob Böhme, wrestled with as she composed the Principia, right? So her second substance, which receives scant scholarly attention usually in articles on Campbell's philosophy, maybe construed along these lines. This is a deity that is supreme being, but also supreme becoming as it develops. With all the people yielding to the influence of divine persuasion. And this is what we find when we take a closer look at More's critical engagement with what became an absolutely pivotal term in European intellectual history, namely the contrario or contractio, the Zimzum. And as you know, the first volume of the Kabbalah Denudata is basically a dictionary or glossary of Kabbalistic terms. And of course, so an immense achievement, obviously, right? So this is the work to use when approaching these texts for the first time. And there's also an article devoted to Zimzum. And here we have in a nutshell what Zimzum is about. This idea, as you can see, so prior to creation, so antequam immanentia creata est creata, so this quasi-poetic language that Christian Knorr uses in his Latin. So it's all very readable and very elegant expression, right? So lux suprema extensa fuerit genissime. So the life was extended in its fullest form, to its fullest, right? So that there couldn't be any life besides it. So as a consequence, it filled every ubi, and here we have all the concepts that could not but appeal to More, could not but browse his keenest interest, right? Agio ut nubis daretur locus vacus in notione lucis, nullum spatium in an. There we have these expressions, right? Ubi locus spatium in an, no vacuum. That could be filled by creation. The extension is mentioned several times. And we've got this idea of one uniform light filling everything, and then the moment of creation arrives, right? So cum autem inventive in hier extenso ruhig. And that extended one that had the idea, right, of creating something, right? Creating words, right? Of emanating something. Right? And then it shows to contracts. Strangely enough, he doesn't use that. But then we have this well-known example. So, appunto quola menu, circum circa, like it withdrew itself, right, from a certain point, so as to leave the void, which then to fill with all the worlds, right? So first Adam, Kabun, then the vessel, and stuff like this. And this is where all the words are then created. And obviously, more being very wary of his own flirtations with a divine world soul and perhaps even a divine becoming was aghast at some of these thoughts, as is clear from the earliest writings, or from all the writings contained in the Cabbalistic data. And now onto the Cabbalistic swelling controversy and commentary on both Zimzum and Macron. And the first thing he rejects, and it's the very notion of the divine undergoing change, right? So if we read these important treatises of Morse as expositions of his own mature metaphysics, he keeps on referring to his Enchiridion Metaphysicum, right? We find him reasserting some of his key ideas against the background of these more heterodox developments among his primary principal dialogue partners and in his own works. And one of the chief misunderstandings he wants to combat when it comes to an orthodox Christian notion of God is the idea of divine change. So the first quote here, in which he asserts divine actuality with a vengeance after his flirtations with Baptism. In the divine being, there are three, whatever you choose to call them, which are eternal, necessary, and immutable, not in the sense of transient or changing operations or actions, but in the sense of permanent inertia, actualities, which present themselves to our mind in complete distinctness. Clearly, all things in God are ineffable. And yet, if it pleases you to stutter where you cannot speak fair, the first perfection is a certain essential goodness that is infinitely happiness. The second is mission wisdom. The third is an infinite joy, love, flowing from the first two as they perceive one another in greatest intimacy. This is more body-form concern with qualitative infinity. God is defined by triad, qualitative infinities, as it were. So, as an infinite substance is infinite goodness, infinite wisdom, and infinite power in a descending hierarchy. At the same time, this qualitative infinity, in a certain sense, calls for corresponding complementary quantitative infinity, which is mentioned here when he talks about the infinite fecundity. So that the infinite goodness in a qualitative sense is infinitely fecund in a quantitative sense, as is omniscient wisdom, is the infinite power, is the hypostasis reconciling those two, making them act in unison in creation. This is something he points out with great clarity as he comments on this misguided notion of Zimzum. So second text here, where he points out this quantitative infinity of the divine. So not only is it infinite in this threefold sense of infinite goodness, infinite wisdom, and infinite power, but it's also of qualitative infinity in its infinite amplitude, which you find expressed in the so-called long phase or aric anpin. Since, however, aric anpin is infinite amplitude, it is obvious that it cannot but be the deity. So the argument we've encountered before. Right? So infinity by itself calls for identification with the deity because it's his exclusive property. In a general representation of the simple aric anpin, the deity corresponds exactly to that immobile infinite extension of which I have provided so clear demonstration in chapter 6 and 7 of my Enchiridion Metaphysicum. In chapter 8, I've also established on the basis of some 20 divine attributes which it possesses, that it is a certain, more confused and general representation of the divine essence or essential presence, insofar as it is separated from its life and operations. This is probably the most famous passage the Enchiridion metaphysicum, right, where he comes close to identifying God and space, always with the caveat that this is not God proper, but as he says here and in the Enchiridion, a more confused and general representation of the divine essence, which in this passage he then proceeds to liken to Böhme's abyss in fact, because it's at this stage that the supreme powers which God will bring to bear on space, right, on his own extension, have not yet acquired a determinate shape. So he calls that the dark Aleph, again drawing on the Kabbalah and giving it a Babylist meaning. This is exactly what I wanted to point out with regard to these overlapping community processes. So the dark Aleph, so this darkness is a space as a bare essence, so harkens back to his poetry, but space that is about to be acted on by these qualitative infinities. And I think it has this Babylist and Cabbalist ring to it, right? So this great idea of this infinite extension, which is about to experience the supremely benign actions of an infinitely good, wise, and powerful being. It is against this background that he tries to rebut this notion of Zimzum, both on ontological grounds and on the grounds of this concept of divine agency. So first, he finds fault with this concept on the basis of the concept of extension. And here we have this clear epistemological argument at work, right? So the Kabbalah is a certain mixed kind of philosophy that blends the imagination and interaction in a legitimate fashion. And this is a case in point of the Zimzum, God undergoing change and literally contracting this fashion so as to leave a vacuum. This concept that he rejects on ontological grounds as being incompatible with the correct notion of extended spirit as developed above all in the Enchiridion metaphysicum. And there are several arguments presented here. So it's basically a sum of more mature ontology of the extended mind. Since, however, this or and so the Cabbalistic concept of infinity or infinite light is of a necessary nature as well as immutable and everywhere identical with itself, how may it happen that it withdraws itself from a single point in order to leave a concavity so vast as to serve as the place for the creation of worlds? So, difficult point when it comes to translation. Stimulus clearly means identity here. So there are no identifiable parts. So this infinite extension is completely uniform. Corresponding.
I was just looking this bit up in the manuscript. The English manuscript is everywhere like himself.
Yeah, it says it's stimulus. So yeah, but I think it in that instance, stimulus I think is closer to the same, and it has to be the meaning here. I think. So something open for debate, because this tough text to translate, so something that has to do with our work in the afternoon, right? So I'm pretty sure that it has to mean the same with itself. So there's complete uniformity.
But my point is just that more himself uses the word like.
Yeah. But the question is, what's the meaning of in modern English? And I say this is what is after here, complete self-identity as becoming the divine, right? Is the nature of God both cracks and corporeal, and can there be worlds where he is? This is an important point. Yes, if God's extension and the world's extension were somehow mutually exclusive, whereas the opposite is the holy sacred truth. Furthermore, this separability or the separation of one part from another is the property of a body, not of a spirit. And since God is everywhere identical with himself, if he can divide his essence from such a point, just through any single point. They were both making a fissure in his total essence and dividing himself into two parts. However, this would be proof against his infinity, which he, as he has said, has provided absolutely cogent evidence in the Enchiridion Metaphysical. Move on, lastly, that vacuum. And again, he finds all with that too, that vacuum that one imagines coming into existence after God has himself from a point is no mere non-entity, but a substance incorporeal necessary existence. Hence, it would follow that there was a spirit of necessary existence, and yet distinct from God, which is impossible. It is therefore obvious that the true God designated by this or and so cannot withdraw himself to a point so as to create a vacuum in which worlds would be created. So I think an immensely interesting excerpt from his anti-Cabbalistic writings, because it harkens back to his original discussions with Descartes, where he rejects a corporeal vacuum, right? So, where he tries independent in order for intelligible or spiritual extension to take its place, right? So the vessel collapsing, and God could prevent the sides from meeting once all material extension has been removed. But obviously, this, on the principles of ontology, doesn't apply to that extent. So there can't be a God vacuum, which is an interesting thesis in its own right. So the Zimzum as a foreshadowing of atheism and God being removed or something, this is impossible in metaphysical and quasi-physical terms. And it all has to do with this life-giving effect that the divine extension is via the spirit of nature in most metaphysical scheme of things. And this is where the final quote where it develops this idea that far from being mutually exclusive, divine and created extension are such that the former allows the latter to prosper and develop life and to flourish in its participation in the divine. So what is needed for life to develop and flourish up to the point that moral agency, intellectual vision of the life come into existence and flourish is not the absence of God and his extension, but his presence, which is by its very nature life-giving. And this is the final passage. I also marvel at the mystery that, and so withdrew itself in order to create a large void in which nothing is believed to have remained, in order that the vessels of emanations and numbers might first come into being and existence. Is it not more reasonable, however, to assume that the presence of God, rather than his absence, is required to create such vessels? Where there is nothing, and again, remember the passage from the pantheism controversy, right? This is the question of creatio ex nihilo and the like, right? Anihilo nihil fit, where there is nothing, nothing can either cause anything or be caused by anything. Nor does the divine presence destroy anything that is good and well composed. Instead strengthens it, since it accords and harmonizes with God's eternal wisdom, which cannot fail to be everywhere. And since it is sustained and preserved by its external word, namely the spirit of nature. So this is one of the conundrums, I say, of most metaphysics, so the relationship between that infinite extension that is God and the finite or infinite extension that is the spirit of nature, and they are closely aligned here to one another, I'd say, right? So makes for an interesting passage, and I think it discloses what most critique of the Kabbalah is about. So this infinity of the divine in its twofold sense, right? Qualitative infinity, so the supreme goodness, which makes God communicate all the ideas and forms contained in his infinite wisdom to a creation outside himself, by virtue of his infinite power or omnipotence on the one hand, right? And this idea of an infinite extension in which all of this develops and flourishes. The infinite extension that is God himself, mediated perhaps by this other entity called the spirit of nature, in which these forms are stored. And I can always hear commenting critically on these aspects of Moore's philosophy, because he comes close, I'd say, to identifying infinite extension, which he always giving a meaning to that accorded with his concerns, with the concerns of his ethical theology. What is its link to these qualitative infinity that God is defined by? And here we have a clear formulation of what such a synthesis might look like, and something that his Harry pupil was clearly working at that time. This then forms the background, and pass over that part rather quickly. So the Spinozist imperial theme, because David has already masterfully introduced us to all of that. So this is exactly what underlies this discussion with Spinoza. So if there is one idea that may be considered the prime driving force of this debate, I'd say it has to be this idea of the infinity of its own kind, as he says. So God's infinity is indeed an infinity, not absolutely, as Spinoza says, but an infinity sui generis, something that he goes to some length to spell out in this later volume of works. And to conclude, right, so part 5, the Cambridge Platon's pantheism, controversy, process, and reality in most Kabbalistic writings, and again referring to the book. So the bilingual edition of these Kabbalistic writings. So there's a clear tradition that is actually inaugurated by Moore himself. And it's not coincidence that later people should identify Kabbalists, and Spinozists. So they read the Kabbalah Denudata, they read Moore. And we can show that with regard to Leibniz, and his follows, Lessing being one of the most prominent followers of Leibniz is obviously, well, we have it in Leibniz. Leibniz comments on the debate between Conway and Moore, siding with Moore against, siding with Conway against Moore, right? Applauding the use of that concept, so that in a way, there's certainly a rationale for that. We can say, building on a thesis advanced several years back by the celebrated German Egyptologist Jan Asp, right? So that the pantheism controversy basically starts with this historic identification effected by Moore in his later writings, right? When he chose to find the same blend of epistemological enthusiasm and ontological materialism in these three writers, whose works, right? So the works dedicated against these three writers, they will be the core, obviously, of this trilogy of the first 3 volumes of our edition. And it all started there. This makes for interesting and indeed historical contribution to intellectual history on the part of the Cambridge Platonists in general and the great Henry Moore in particular.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed.